both of my parents are deaf, and I have a deaf brother. I think deaf people were looked down upon much more. But I feel like for me, my education was very divided. We didn't have cell phones at all, or even people didn't really use computers, so we had what was called a TTY, a teletypewriter, that sort of would take them.
Hi everyone, this is Simon, and in this episode, we have the honor to invite Ms. Jami Fisher, the Senior Lecturer of Deaf Culture and ASL, and also the Director of American Sign Language Program in the University of Pennsylvania. She will share her own stories about the identity of being CODA, a child of deaf adults, and also her educational experiences throughout her life. So without further ado, let's enjoy this video. To start with, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you were born, and what are your background, especially as a CODA, child of deaf adults?
Sure. My name is Jami Fisher, and I was born and raised here in Philadelphia. Both of my parents are deaf, and I have a deaf brother, and I have another brother who's the youngest who is hearing, and so he and I are CODAs. Sometimes we're called, where I am, since I'm the oldest, I'm called a thumb or a thumb CODA because with my brother, I'm the oldest, so I'm the thumb. But let's see. So because my parents are deaf, ASL was really my first language, though I had hearing family members around me who also exposed me to English. And so I've known English and ASL my whole life, both of them equally.
So you learned ASL first instead of English as first, right?
That's right. So with American Sign Language, since most of my exposure was from my parents, which is typical for children, then I was just signing with my parents primarily, but also with all babies because the vocal tract takes a longer time to develop than our gross motor coordination. Babies are able to sign and express themselves through sign faster than they can through speaking. So my signing progressed faster. Same with my son. My son is hearing, but I taught him ASL since he was a baby, and so he signed before he spoke as well.
Could you tell us about stories in your younger period of life, and how does the identity as CODA affect you, and how does the family or your parents impact on you?
Yeah, sure. So I think every CODA has a different story, and I think the generations are also different. There's much more recognition now of what's appropriate to ask a child to do and what's maybe not appropriate. So my generation was sort of on the side of there was less technology, there was less awareness of what would be appropriate. I think deaf people were looked down upon much more, even though I think they're still looked down upon quite a bit. So for my generation, we were, especially in oldest CODA, much more responsible for interpreting for my parents in situations like medical or in school, or since hearing people didn't understand how to use we didn't have cell phones at all, or even people didn't really use computers. So we had what was called a TTY, a teletypewriter, that sort of you would take the receiver of the phone and put it onto the machine and then type, sort of like how a modem would send messages. And so you need to have another one on the other end. And so deaf people could communicate with one another that way, but hearing people couldn't communicate. They'd have to either know to use a relay service, but that wasn't open all the time. So I was used a lot for communication to the outside world. And so that was something that I just did all my life. Also, I think sometimes hearing family members didn't really, they kind of still looked down upon deaf people. So I think that there was a lot of conflicting messages of deaf people, perceptions of deaf people, but also my hearing family members didn't communicate directly with my parents either. They would go through me. So there was a lot of that. Whereas now generations, I think deaf people are much more aware of not doing that to their children because it's hard. It makes you grow up a lot faster. And so my brother, for example, he has two young girls, 11 and almost 9. And they don't have that experience at all. They are never asked to interpret. They might be one word here and there, but never put in situations where they have to interpret it in a serious setting. But also in the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act passed in 1991, which required interpreters to be provided and paid for by businesses and organizations rather than the deaf individual. So because of that, there are laws that require interpreters to be provided. So there's like also that generational difference as well. There are much more rights for deaf people now than there were when I was growing up.
Adding on to that, because I've watched the movie CODA, and the protagonist in there also was used as a tool of communication. In your life, did you face or encounter any like big challenges or obstacles, and how overcome them? For example, identity crisis or differences between deaf culture and hearing culture?
That's a great question. I think that the film really like sometimes humorously showed situations that I would have been put in, like the doctor's office. Like that was kind of a funny scene.
Derechos. His, you know.
Right, well, so the layman's term for what you both have is jock itch. It's common if you spend a lot of time in damp clothes, and it's easily transferable via intercourse. Yeah, I'll give you an antifungal cream, but you both have to keep the area dry and avoid sex for 2 weeks.
It happens. I mean, those things happen, and sometimes it's not so trivial. Like, you know, I've been in situations where I've interpreted for my family in serious medical situations, and that's hard and traumatic. Plus, I'm like not qualified to do that because even though I might know the signs, I'm not an interpreter. And it's not fair to me. But also like Ruby, the character, the CODA in the movie, she was really like, her parents really made her feel like she had to, or that her parents really relied on her to do like business stuff. Whereas her brother was like, no, we can do it. Like, I'm perfectly capable, which I think is representative of a more younger like generation. But Ruby, I think, felt really conflicted. Like she felt like her parents needed her, but she wasn't sure, like, but she also wanted to move on with her own life and have her own identity that was different from her parents. And I definitely felt that too, in the sense of like, I went off to college, but then in my brain, I was like, there's no guessing of what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to Philadelphia because my family needs me. They never told me that, but that was like internalized by me. But then very quickly I was like, oh, no, this is not what I want at all. And so I moved to Boston for a little bit, but then I eventually ended up back here, partly because I think my family, like I feel really connected to my family, but I think my parents are still of that generation and I'm still of the generation where they rely on me, even though I tell them, and they're very aware of and make use of the technology that's available. And there's still a habit there.
You just talked about the education that you received. In terms of that, could you share a bit about your stories about how you receive education? Like, is there speaking therapy and something related to speaking therapy?
Sure. So I never, like, there are definitely CODAs who have experiences of like speech delays because they're not around family people who can give them that feedback to correct. But I didn't have that problem. I had family all around. And so I didn't have any speech impediments, but they definitely existed. But I feel like for me, my education was very divided. When I was in school, I was in this hearing bubble, and like I just was a hearing child. I didn't act like I had deaf family. Like it was just not something that came up. My brain was sort of split, right? And then I would go home and live in this deaf bubble. But like the two, if they overlapped, sometimes I would be the intermediary, but they were very divided for me. So like in my education, I just sort of went on this track of like, okay, I progressed through school, and then my next step is college, and I just went to college and I did all of that stuff on my own. I was very independent. I didn't really have my parents' involvement in the sense that like there was just a language difference that they couldn't help me with my homework sometimes. So I just never needed to ask. But I did a lot of that stuff by myself, like applying to college. I did it on my own. It's kind of, I feel like I look back and I'm amazed that like I was able to do it kind of. So education for me was kind, I mean, it still is my field. So it was kind of a very comfortable area for me where I just like felt like I just kept going next. So, but like with relation to my work, I always felt like connected to the deaf world. When I was in college, there were not opportunities, like people didn't really know about deaf people or ASL. Like it was not discussed in any of my academic work. I was kind of in my own bubble of the hearing world, and like I kind of would go home to my deaf family, but didn't have any overlap. But then I always felt like it was something that I wanted to do, and this job happened. Like I just, I was a teacher for a long time, but this was something like is perfect for me because it's my language, my first language, but also I feel very connected to the community, and I really integrate community efforts into my work.